All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Stir Trek 2019. I'm so excited that you chose to come to my talk specifically today. I think it'll be a valuable talk for you. And it's going to be, they don't make them like they used to, integrating junior developers into your team. So before I get started talking really about what we do want to make sure we're doing, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do not want. And what we do not want are red shirts. We don't want people who their first foray into the development world, they accidentally step on a rock and get blown up, or they accidentally get phasered to death, or they get stabbed by some sort of spear thing. We want people who are going to be productive members of our team in the long run. We want to acquire talent in the rough and then make sure that we're developing it. Make sure that the team doesn't need extras. It doesn't need people who are going to get burned out immediately. It needs people who are going to really be able to develop. We want people who, after long enough working with them, they're going to be really, really solid members of our team, and someday, just maybe, they'll die in a season finale in a dramatic death. So who am I to say this? My name is Clower, and unfortunately, I myself was a red shirt. I started my career as a teacher, and pretty soon after beginning teaching, I was brutally murdered by the inhabitants of the planet that I was on. The unruly hordes of young children. I decided instead to switch career paths and become a junior developer, and because of the excellent onboarding and team-structured environment, I eventually became a productive team member. And all of this happened at Workstate Consulting, which is a web development and consulting firm downtown Columbus. It's an excellent place to work. I highly enjoy working there because they really have built me up and made me a better person. I have worked on PHP and Drupal 8 specifically as a web developer for a notable customer. You may have heard of them, called CBS. I've helped redesign a couple of different websites of theirs, including the RachelRayShow.com and StarTrek.com. So how do we prevent our red shirts from becoming red shirts? Well, for starters, we're going to need to welcome them on board the USS Enterprise with some onboarding best practices. Then we're going to teach them how to set phasers to stun with some replicable technology setup. Next, we're doctors, not teachers. We've got some effective technical teaching methods, though, to help you make sure that you're able to teach them effectively. And finally, we're going to teach them how to live long and prosper by integrating them and developing them into our team. So for starters, all aboard the USS Enterprise, some onboarding best practices that I want you to keep in mind. We need to make day one count. So on day one, when they get to the office, we need to make sure that they have a computer available. There's nothing worse, and I'm sure some of you have been there. You start a job, and a couple days down the line, you still don't have anything that you're actively doing because you don't have your computer readily available. We want to make sure that they're getting that time to set it up. It's an easy introductory thing, and you're just wasting your company's money if you don't have that available for them. Apple, in fact, on their very first day, they give them a brand new MacBook in their box and say, hey, set this up the way that you want. This will allow them to set it up, get an easy thing out of their way, some of the stress, the nerves, and they can also learn some of the company specific tools. Next up, I know a lot of people work remote, a lot of people at my job work remote. Try and bring everybody who's going to be on their team to the office on that day. Try and make sure that they're getting to know the people on their team. The most important part for junior developers is they're going to have people to ask questions for, and they're not going to ask questions to people that they feel really uncomfortable with. So if you're bringing everybody together as a group and they're asking, talking, it doesn't need to be anything about work, just socializing with them. They're going to get that comfortable feeling, and then in the long run, they're going to be able to ask them questions. And a great way to do this is over lunch. If you can take them out for lunch, that's fantastic. If not, pizza's pretty cheap. Just bring that into the office. Next up, you're going to want to assign a buddy team member. So this is going to be somebody that's not super, super smart. Not somebody that can answer every single question that they have, because that's intimidating. We've all worked for that person that knows every single thing about the open source software that they helped write, and it's like you ask them a question and you get an hour-long lecture about the history behind it. We want somebody that's just going to be able to answer the questions quickly, and that they're not going to be afraid to say, like, hey, I accidentally just deleted the entire Git repo. What do I do? Or, what did that person mean when he said cd up a directory? That's just complete gibberish to me. And finally, on the first day, you want to make sure you're keeping it low stakes. So make sure it's a nice, comforting environment. You don't need to pile on a whole bunch of stuff that they need to do on the very first day. Instead, just keep it kind of relaxed. Again, feeling comfortable is more important for them. Now, for the first couple weeks, it's going to be your responsibility as a team member, and especially as a team lead, to make sure that you're maintaining some documentation for them about tools that they're going to use. So things like they're starting their company and you need to have them set up these 5 different things. We're going to make some documentation about how to do that, and we're actually going to talk about this a little bit later. Next, you're going to want to have them turn in some stuff. Most kids are going, or most junior developers are going to be coming from an education background. They're going to be used to getting their assignments. The assignment says it needs to be 2,000 words and it needs to be turned in on Friday at 3 p.m. on this basket on my desk. I want you to give them some mini deliverables. It could be something like, okay, in stand-up tomorrow, I want you to give us just like a little 2-minute thing on 10 commands for bash that you think will be useful. This will really help them learn something. It'll help them put it, solidify, codify their knowledge, and then you can also give them feedback on it. Say, okay, you listed those commands. Those were all really useful. I use those on a day-to-day basis, but also you might throw in these extra ones. Next, as a team member, you're going to want to be checking in with the buddy. If the buddy's not doing their job, if the person's too scared to talk to their buddy, then that's a problem. So make sure that you're checking in with the buddy, that they're still having conversations. Maybe if you notice that the buddy partnership isn't quite working out, you might swap out their buddy and say, okay, well, come to this person more often for questions. Next, you're going to want to provide context. Let it be known what your strengths are and what they should come to you for. And let it be known what the other people on your team, what their strengths are. These contacts, the people that they can ask about various questions, are just going to be as important for answers. We've all spent a lot of time Googling around for answers and not coming to any good website, and then we find one specific thing. Think of that in terms of your team members. Instead of Googling around, they're asking the right person. Next, again, most of these people are coming from an academic environment. They're used to strict timelines. So communicate with them when you want something done. Say, okay, I expect you to have your computer set up in 3 days and with these 4 different programs. If you're giving them that definitive timeline, then that's giving them an idea of what you expect from them. But keep it flexible. Honestly, most of us have been in the development field for so long that like, oh, I need to install a new Linux distribution on my machine. That's just like a 2-hour project. For them, it's going to be a lot longer. So go ahead and think of that timeline, but make sure it's not super stressed out. They don't need to be freaking out that, oh God, I haven't done anything and we're 2 days in. For them, though, they're going to have some responsibility of themselves. They're going to need to be able to set up their technology, which you'll be able to help with. I want them to develop a pitfall document or document their pitfalls for future onboarding people. If you're onboarding people in the future and they had a really bad problem setting up these type of systems, then make sure they're writing down those procedures, what they did to finally overcome that. That's going to help your team run more smoothly in the future. Next, they're going to actually need to be preparing these mini projects. If you tell them to do something and they're not doing something, you need to make sure that you're talking with them and figuring out what the problem was. Next, they're going to need to rely on their buddy when the embarrassing issues come up, like, oh, I have no clue what any of this technology is, I feel like a fraud. If they go talk to their buddy, that's going to be the person to help them out with that. Next, go to the variety of sources that we talked about. If you're giving them contacts, expect them to go to the various people. And finally, have them make sure that they're meeting the deadlines, or at least that they're communicating why they won't be able to make the deadlines. So sometimes it could be like, okay, well, I really struggled with these 3 things, but I actually figured those 3 things out, and here's what I learned. That's way better than them saying like, oh no, I couldn't do that. And it's like, well, why couldn't you do that? Did you have problems with it? Did you need to ask questions of me? Make sure that they're communicating in advance their problems. Finally, for onboarding, structure is going to be key. So you're going to want to make sure that you're creating this technical onboarding document that they're going to read through. And we'll talk about that a little bit better. That's going to help your junior developer help themselves figure out their place in the world. Next, you're going to want to make sure you're communicating your expectations clearly. Like I said, have mini deliverables, have concrete thing that you can say, hey, I want you to have these 4 programs installed by this day, and if you don't, make sure that you're coming to me with questions, help ask them, make sure you're checking in with them. And then finally, you're going to want to set goals. So a short-term goal might be something like have these mini deliverables ready, or have these programs set up. A long-term goal, have them just write down things that they find are confusing. So like, in a year, I want to be able to use Git without thinking about it. Or in a year, I want to be able to navigate the terminal and not have any problems. Anything that they're really struggling with, because honestly, they're going to go back and look at these goals that they set for themselves a year ago and be like, wow, I was having a problem with that. It's really going to help them develop as a person and figure out, oh man, I was way better now. I'm way more valuable now than I was back then, and that's going to give them a confidence boost. So now we're going to do a little activity. I know it's early in the morning, but I want you to get out some paper if you're taking notes, or get out your phone, open up like an email draft, or if you have Evernote or a notes app, do that. And I want you, for 4 minutes, to write down one positive and one negative onboarding experience you've had. So it could be something like, oh, this old company that I had did a really good job of making sure that I felt comfortable providing me the technology I needed. And then also write down one positive, one negative about your team's most recent onboarding. So somebody who joined your team that you helped onboard, what's something that your team did really well, and what's something that your team could improve on. So go ahead and do this. I'm going to set a timer, and we'll see just where we are at the end of that. All right? Muted. Yeah? Okay, cool. Yes, sir. No, just write it down. Yeah. Oh, okay. But that's not a bad idea. I could suggest that in the future. How are you guys doing? Are you mostly done? Yeah? Okay, cool. All right, unmute. All right, so next up, a little bit more collaboration. I want everybody to raise your hand. Raise your hand up. High five somebody next to you. That person's your buddy. I want you to talk with them a little bit about what you just wrote down. Go ahead and talk about the positive experiences you have, the negative experiences you've had, and what you could do better. Thanks. Yeah? He's not here today.
I know. We can talk about it. Can't figure out which one it is.
I don't know. It's something I ran into while teaching. How are you guys doing in your conversation? Good? About time? Okay. All right, I recognize not everybody got to share everything. I'm sorry about that, but we do need to move on a little bit. Keep this in mind, though, as you're onboarding your next person, think about the things that you could improve. And hopefully you have this written down somewhere. You can look at it in the future and be like, oh yeah, those were the things that we talked about during that conference. Also, I promise you're not going to have to interact with anybody the rest of the day. Or at least I'm not going to make you do that. It's also very, very important that your company is onboarding people well. In fact, an HR website, SHRM, told that if they interviewed somebody, 58% of people who had a good onboarding experience were likely to stay at the company for 3 years. So if you invest the time in your onboarding experience and make sure that it's really good for them, then you're going to get that continued benefit from having these employees who actually know what they're doing for a good time span. All right, so next up we're going to talk about set phasers to stun. And this is how to set up your technology. All right, so what tech does your junior developer need? So another activity, but again, you're not going to have to talk to somebody. I want you to, on that same notepad or on that same draft, for 2 minutes, write down all the tech, the hardware, if you work in a really hardware-intensive place, the software, the languages that you use on a day-to-day basis. I want you to think through your entire day, starting from turning on your computer to closing it at the end of the day. And if the version number is really important, like my websites only work on PHP 7.0, not on 7.2, go ahead and write down that version number as well. Okay? So go ahead and do that for me. I know you're still thinking, but here are some examples of the stuff that I use on a day-to-day basis that might help jog your memory. So as you can see, this is a pretty intimidating list. If you gave this to somebody on day one and said, you need to know and understand and use all of this and install all of this onto your computer right now, they would probably freak out, especially if they're a junior developer. They're going to be like, oh God, I don't know what half of these words are, and I don't know how to install them. And especially for me, on my very first day, they told me to install, like, just get rid of Windows on your machine. We're not using that. It's hard to use for what we're doing. Just install Ubuntu. I was like, I have never, ever used Linux before. And that also came with the learning curve of figuring out what buttons meant left, right, up, and down on Vi, or figuring out how to run Bash. All of those type of things I needed to learn because I had to swap operating systems. So what I want you to do is on this same list, I want you to assess what technology you use and what technology you think your junior developer will need. So I want you to categorize your list. NI is not important. These are things that, like, for instance, I just did a lot of accessibility for the site that I'm working on currently. I have an accessibility checker on my Chrome as a browser extension. A junior developer is not going to need that. I are things that you need to have installed at the beginning of your time there, and then you can forget about, like for me, setting up Apache. Once you're on Linux, it just goes automatically. Or things that are intuitive, so things that you shouldn't need to teach, like how to use Slack or how to use Chrome. And then finally, you are the things that you need to understand in order to use. These are things that maybe you'll need to teach them or they'll need to learn about. So things might be like Bash or NPM or Node, the things that they're actually going to need to spend the time with in order to learn. So go ahead and write those categorizations right next to your software. All right, I know some of you are still working, but I'm going to move on for the sake of time. You can see in my first column, most of those are NIs. Things that I use, they're useful, but honestly, they're not something that a junior developer needs at the very beginning. You could put them at like a bottom of a thing saying like, hey, by the way, eventually you might want this, like Xdebug, super handy being able to debug my code for website development. Honestly, they're probably not going to need that for the first month or so that they're there. Next up is a column full of Is. These are things that they can install, they should know how to use. Like Slack, there are great commands that you can use, learn how to do GIFs in it, stuff like that, but honestly, it's intuitive. Finally, you see two full columns of Us. And these are the problematic ones. These are the ones that you actually have to teach. So the fact that it's twice the amount of the other two columns, that should be a little bit scary. But some of them are honestly relatively easy. They are weird to use, but they're not super hard to use. Like Bash, if you know like a list of 10 commands, then you're probably going to be good to use it. Same with gulp. Like I use gulp on a day-to-day basis, but I just run one gulp command. That's all I ever do. Some of them are more time intensive. Things like learning how to actually write and code for Drupal 8, that is still not something I'm comfortable with a full year later. I want you, for your homework, is to make this list a living document. So transfer it to a Google Doc or like a Word document or something. I want you to organize it based off of the importance that you think the various technology is. Obviously, I couldn't have installed 3/4 of the stuff until I installed my operating system. So figure out the exact order that you want things to be in and how much time you think it'll take for them to actually figure out how to use this stuff. I want you to share it with your team members. The people who are on your team, they probably use some technology that you forget about. Maybe they use a virtual machine to run all their code and you just installed Linux. Ask for their additions and then think about time estimates. Now again, we talked about junior developers. They're brand new to this. They don't know what the time should take. Go ahead and multiply your time estimates by like 5 or 6, honestly. If it takes you 2 or 3 hours to set up Linux on your machine, it might take a junior developer who's never worked with that before, like 3 or 4 days. I'm not even kidding. And that's all right. They've never done this before. Next, try and find some resources. If there's some really handy stuff that you always use when you're talking about X technology, go ahead and figure that out and put it underneath as like a hyperlink. Next, I want you to list some pitfalls that you would have, and this is the document that they're going to be adding their own pitfalls to. As they're going through, they're going to make sure that they're putting all of this in. And then finally, I want you to share it with your junior developers. Actually, share it with anybody who joins your team. This is excellent for them to learn. All right? So keep this in mind as homework. If you have to, set a Google Calendar reminder. This is going to be way easier to think of right now than it is going to be like the day before your new person starts and you're like, oh crap, what was that thing that the guy said at Stir Trek? If you do it all right now, it's going to be way easier in the future for you. Okay. Next up, I'm a doctor, not a teacher. We're going to be talking about effective technical teaching methods. So for starters, you want to make sure that you're bringing backwards design to the forefront of your lesson and that you're differentiating for each developer. You're also going to want to make sure that you're scaffolding to help build your developer's confidence and that you're keeping Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences in mind while you're teaching. Just kidding. Especially in coding, vocab and jargon matter. Coding is like a foreign language. If you live in China every single day for 5 years and some new person moves over there and joins your team and they only speak English, you're not going to look at them like they're an idiot if you go out to a restaurant and they don't know what to order. You're going to be like, yeah, of course, it doesn't make sense for them to know Chinese. But for some reason, we do this with software. We think to ourselves, hey, yeah, I know all of this stuff. Why doesn't this person who just joined my team? Like, this is easy. It's not like we're speaking a different language. But honestly, you are. You're speaking all of this technology jargon that they've never heard before, that they don't understand. What you need to do is meet your junior developer where they are. Just introduce them to a little bit at a time and figure out where they are. And a great way to do this, a great structure, is the tree model of learning. So the roots are the things that all junior developers should know, like how to read or how to turn on their computer. You would expect this. It would be really bad if you hired a junior developer who didn't know this. The trunk is your solid base of knowledge. So things like HTML or CSS or PHP, if they're a web developer, these are things that they should have a solid base of knowledge on in order to understand what you're about to go into in depth, which is where the branches are. These are the more specific knowledge. So say you've worked a lot with CSS in your junior development practice or at school, but you've never worked with a precompiler like SAS. Or maybe you've done a lot of Drupal, but you've never done a framework like, you've worked with a lot of PHP, but you've never done a framework with Drupal. Or you've worked with a lot with JavaScript, but you've never used jQuery. That one's a joke. The twigs are the really nitty-gritty stuff. So these are the syntax. Maybe they know how to write a for loop in another language, but they would need to look it up. This is things like you would use a dictionary for in the foreign, or if you're learning a foreign language. You're going to be reading with a book, and you're going to have a dictionary right beside it. And every time you come to a new word, you're going to be looking at the dictionary. What does that word mean? As you read this book, as you get more and more comfortable with the foreign language, you're not going to need to look that up. So at the beginning, they're going to be Googling stuff all of the time. And they're going to be like, what's the syntax for doing this specific thing? After like a couple weeks, they're not going to need to look that up anymore. They've done that. And finally, the leaves are the visual demonstration of their skill. This is something like a merged-in commit or an actual website that they created, or even the mini deliverables that we talked about. This is a usable end product, and this is what you really want, but you can't have leaves just floating in the sky like they are in this picture. They really need to be attached to branches, which need to be attached to the trunk, which need to be attached to the roots. So you cannot just expect them to come up with a deliverable if they don't have this strong foundation of things that they're learning. Now, this tree model isn't just me making some stuff up. In fact, you guys are all intimately familiar with it, even if you don't know it, because of video games. Tech trees are a super, super common thing. Spider-Man can't swing down the web or down the streets of Manhattan at 40 miles an hour until he learns how to web swing. He can't beat up 30 thugs until he knows how to beat up one thug. Think of all of the stuff that you do on a day-to-day basis like a tech tree. You need to unlock the things as you go on, and that'll help you. It'll help put a good framework in your mind of like, okay, well, I'm going to start talking about how to use this specific thing in Drupal 8, but they need to understand like twig blocks and HTML, and then in order to do that, they need to understand these 5 different things. And if you think backwards along that tech tree about the different things that they need to learn, then that will really help you solidify their knowledge. And you need to figure out where they are to start. 90% of teaching is asking questions. So a good question will start with a very broad topic. So like, okay, so have you ever used a templating engine before? No, I haven't. Okay, well, do you know what that might be like or what that might entail? I really have no idea. Okay, so a templating engine is where you create just specific blocks and then you're able to put those blocks into various things and make them reusable. Oh, you mean so like a function? Yeah, exactly like a function. They're a lot like that. And you work with what they know and you work your way into a more narrow thing. Then, okay, here's how you write the syntax for this element and here's how you put it into your HTML page. Ask open-ended but leading questions. If you give them assignment and you say, hey, set up your server, and they're like, I have no clue how to set up a server, say, do you understand, or can you explain to me what a server is? And they'll probably be able to give you some explanation, even if it's not great, and then say, yeah, here are the couple of things that might help visualize it, and then say, okay, do you know what like server-side languages are? No, I have no clue. And develop them, figure out where they are, ask these open-ended questions that they can answer or that you can go into. Next, you're going to want to be answering their questions. So in advance, prepare for the common questions that they're going to ask. If you know that it's always a roadblock coming up against this one thing, be ready to talk about that thing. For instance, Git. Git is super, super stupid, especially if you're just starting it. It's handy, don't get me wrong, it's really useful, but why is it called like pushing and pulling and all this stuff? It makes sense once you've worked with it for a couple of years, but when you're just starting out, you're like, none of this language makes any sense to me. Be ready to talk about this with your junior developers. Next, avoid tangents. They don't need a history lesson. If you tell them to install Linux, don't go into an hour-long discussion about why distros are better and which ones are better, and they don't need to know who Linus is. Your time is valuable, so don't waste the time with the leaves when you can explain the roots or the branches. Next, you want to not talk down to this. Now, this is going to be hard, honestly, because you're going to be asking these questions that you think are super stupid questions, but they're going to be like, I don't get this. And your instinct is going to be like, well, why don't you get this? This is really easy. It's a foreign language. Think of it like a foreign language. You wouldn't ask somebody who doesn't understand certain words in a foreign language, like, why don't you get that word? Why don't you remember it? Next, you want to check in often. A lot of junior developers are uncomfortable with the knowledge that they have, and they're not going to come to you being like, hey, I actually don't get what you meant when you said this like 20 minutes ago in our conversation. If you're checking in on a regular basis, just break it up into 5 minutes. Like, okay, we're going to talk about X for a little bit, and talk about X for like 5 minutes max, and then be like, okay, do you have questions about that? Was there anything you were unclear about? Next, there are no stupid questions. Now, don't get me wrong. Junior developers are going to ask you stupid questions. It's a thing. Stupid questions do exist. However, a stupid question in a foreign language would be like, oh, what's the word for the small animal? It barks, it wags its tail. A dog? Yet you don't know the word for dog? Like, you're not going to have that reaction. Instead, you're going to say, oh, yeah, it's just a dog. They're going to remember that after long enough speaking this language. You shouldn't react with kind of, how do you not know that? Because they haven't spent the time that you have learning this. Speaking of dogs, here's my puppy. He's real cute. Finally, we're going to talk about live long and prosper, and this is integrating your junior developers into your team and developing them. So in order to become a better team member, first off, you need to lose the back in my day, I had to do all of this stuff mentality, because that's not helpful to them. They're a team member. They're somebody that you're going to want to be working with, that you really need to going to focus on developing. If you're just saying like, oh yeah, well you need to go through this because it's a rite of passage and it's hard, then that's just going to take even more time to integrate your junior developer and have them actually work for you. If instead you say like, here are some resources that I always used when learning this, here are some ways that you can think about this problem that might help you visualize it, that's going to be way more beneficial than just saying, hey, struggle through it. Next, you're going to want to help prepare the resources. Like we talked about with the technical onboarding document, make sure that you're contributing to that. Make sure that other developers on your team are contributing to that. Next, you're going to want to find somewhere online that explains Git. It's stupid. Just find something, a good resource. Next, I want you to be patient. So like I said, it might take a junior developer 4 to 5 times what you would expect them to take, but if they develop long enough and you work with them for long enough, then pretty soon they'll have that time cut down in half, and then in half again. And pretty soon they'll be a productive member of society. But that doesn't happen if you're not patient with them in the first place. That said, being patient doesn't just mean like, hey, you get more time to do this because you didn't succeed. Make sure that you're figuring out the roadblocks that they're experiencing. Make sure that you're talking to them on a regular basis so that way they're not wasting their own time spinning in circles. Finally, stand up for your people. I work at a consulting company, so we work for clients. And while my clients have been pretty good, I could imagine times when they're like, hey, why haven't you finished this deliverable yet? Don't just throw your junior developer under the bus being like, oh, well, this person hasn't finished their assignment yet. Or even if you're in stand-up and they're like, well, I was working on this, and the Scrum Master's like, well, why haven't you finished this quicker? Be like, oh, well, they ran into, as a team member, say, they ran into these problems, we're working to fix them, and we'll get them sorted out a little bit. And if you're standing up for them, that's going to make them feel much more comfortable. Finally, we're going to help avoid some common junior developer pitfalls. So after you get to know your junior developer, after you've worked with them for a month or two, ask them about their real weaknesses. Not like, oh, I just try so hard, or I struggle integrating myself into a team. Like, that's a big deal. Like, okay, they wouldn't answer that in an interview question. But if they say something like procrastination, honestly, I'm bad at procrastination. I have a hard time. I need a firm deadline. If you know that's a weakness of theirs, then you can give them firm deadlines. Be like, okay, well, I want you to have your initial commit on this problem by the end of day today. And that'll give them that incentive, that drive, being like, oh, crap, that deadline's coming up. I need to work on this. Even if they're not going to submit the PR for a long time, that'll have them in that mindset of, I need something done. Next, they might have a problem with asking questions. So this is somewhere where you can go to them and be like, hey, do you have questions? But you won't know to do that unless you actually figure out those weaknesses. Another that I think is pretty common is not being able to handle pressure. They know that they're supposed to have this deliverable for you, but they've really struggled on it, and so they shut down and they get on their phone and peruse Reddit for like 2 minutes, and that's 30 minutes, and then like they're 30 minutes behind where they were, and you've assigned them another task, and then they get even more overwhelmed. If you're checking in with them on a regular basis and making sure that they're comfortable with what they're doing and that they're not being roadblocked by anything, then that's going to happen, or that's going to help them handle that pressure. But these are just 3 examples. There are lots more weaknesses that people have. Make sure you understand those weaknesses, so as a team member and as a boss, you can help them overcome them. Next, you want to be able to help them overcome their reliance on the internet. And I know most of us, all of us, Google things on a day-to-day basis. We look at a Stack Overflow question, we're like, oh, duh, we should have done that. Why didn't I think of doing that? That's so much easier. Junior developers won't necessarily have that reaction. They'll say like, oh, this person has this chunk of code. I'm just going to copy and paste that into here, and why doesn't that work? And pretty soon you'll end up with 5 different libraries, none of which are needed, all of which they needed just like one simple line. So a great way to overcome this challenge is to force them to write comments into their code. Even if they're copying and pasting it from somewhere, be like, explain what you're doing at each step along the way. And they'll realize like, oh, these 10 functions that I passed in here, I only actually need one of them. Only one of them is valuable. And as they're working through the code, that's going to help them develop as developers. And pretty soon, they'll be able to pick out the good nuggets on Stack Overflow and be like, oh, these are the 3 lines that I need. I don't need the rest of this crap. Next, again, most of them are coming from a schooling environment. Give them specific expectations and assignments. Those specific expectations are saying, like, I want you to have this done by now, but then make sure you're following up with them, make sure they're not being roadblocked, make sure you're asking them questions. All right, so what I want you to do when you're thinking about this in the future is prepare in advance. If you know you're hiring a new person onto your team, review those onboarding documents, especially if it's a junior developer. The more concise you can make it, the more clear you can make it, the better. Make sure you're having their hardware available for them, that they're going to start the day off right. Make sure that you've got those onboarding materials, not just technical documents, but that you're getting everybody into your team to show up and say hi to them. Make sure you've got those assignments in mind. Here are 5 different things that they might not know about. I could honestly write those assignments right now almost as like a lab that they would have to do for homework and figure those out. Next, I want you to think of their education like a skill tree. They need to unlock X before they can move on to what I'm teaching them. And this will be really beneficial for them in the long run. Next, I want you to ask them questions on a super regular basis. Now, I realize that's going to take a lot of your time, but it's honestly better to have a full another member of your team be productive in the long run than it is to just kind of ignore them. And finally, just be patient with them. They're learning. You had to learn at some point. All of us had to learn at some point. You need to walk before you can run. Don't just hurry them along and say, hey, I expect you to get all of this done. All right, that sums it up. Do I have questions? Yes, you. In the Slack channel? Yeah, this will be posted into the Slack channel probably later today because I don't think I have internet at AMC. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Do you have any tips on making your workplace attractive to junior developers?
So the question is if I had any tips on making the workplace attractive to junior developers. A really good way of doing this is to provide the typical like hip amenities type thing. So make sure that my company provides lunch every Friday, so I know like, oh, if I go in on Friday, not only will I get lunch provided for, but I'll also get a nice social environment where I can talk to people. I won't feel so isolated. I moved to Columbus and immediately started working here, and it was like, oh, I actually have some friends at work after just a week or two because I was actually able to go to that. Another way that you can is show them what you can give them. So a lot of people are like, oh God, I don't understand any of this. I'm freaked out even applying to these jobs. Be like, hey, we've onboarded X amount of people in the last year. We're really comfortable with this environment. We're ready to have you on your team, even if you feel like it might be a reach for you to come here. We still want you to come here and develop your talent. Is that all right? Yes, sir. Okay. Okay, so the question is how to handle multiple, especially if one is taking up all of your time asking you questions. So a great way of doing that is, again, providing that documentation at the beginning, figuring out the common pitfalls that they might have. We had 2 people that were onboarded at about the exact same time for the exact same project, and so I prepared like a half-hour-long presentation about what is Drupal. And we went into this presentation, I gave them this through, and then they were able to ask questions together, they were able to iron out their knowledge at the same time, and if you're presenting to both of them in a structured manner where you've actually thought through exactly how you're gonna present that, that's really good. Now, the asking too many questions is really hard because you do want people to ask you questions, but we've all been there where you have somebody that's just asking you questions nonstop, nonstop, nonstop. A really good way to overcome that problem is to have them write down their questions in advance and then write down their answers that you give them. Give them a short, concise answer, especially if it's something pretty easy, that they can write down and then reference every time they come up to that question. And if they're still asking you those same questions, you can be like, hey, did you check your book? Did you see what I answered last time? And they'll be like, oh no, I haven't done that yet. That's gonna save you a lot of time in the long run because they'll be answering their questions. And since they wrote that down, that's gonna help them commit it to memory. So the question is, how do I introduce a new developer into the clients? Well, I would just say like, oh, this is our new developer. He's a junior developer. He's going to be a very valuable asset to our team in the long run. We're going to make sure that we're getting him up to speed as quickly as possible and that he's really going to be of value to our team. You want to convince your clients, they're spending a lot of money on you and on your junior developers. You want to convince your clients that in the long run, it's going to be the best for them. After all, like, I feel like I'm a very, very good contributing member to my team after like 3 months of working on a project. But then from that on, I'm able to really benefit my team and be super helpful. So just convince them of their value, even if it's going to be a little bit more time up front. Any more questions? Okay, any more questions from in the audience? Yes? So my onboarding experience when I was teaching was terrible, which is why I was a red shirt. When I was teaching, I had a buddy teacher, but her office, I kid you not, or her classroom, was 5-minute run across campus from me. It was a relatively large high school, and I was stuck out in a portable, like behind the school, and she was all the way across. So if I had any sort of question, I would need to wait until my break period, or I could just leave my classroom, run across, ask her the question, and then run back over 10 minutes, which you can't do in high school. That's just not a thing. However, my onboarding experience here, I had my buddy, one desk in front of me, so anytime I had a question, I could just lean out, hey, what does this mean? And ask him a really stupid question, and he could just like look over at my screen and be like, oh yeah, just do this. Because I had that buddy there, he was really able to help me out. Another really good thing that I experienced while onboarding was just the introduction onto all of my team members. When I was teaching, like I said, I was just stuck in that portable. I didn't know anybody around me because I didn't really have anybody around me. Whereas when I started at Workstate, I really had a good community of people that I could go to with different questions. Even if not all of them knew PHP or Drupal, a lot of them had experience with Git. And I would know like, okay, I've been bugging this one person so much recently, I'm gonna go ask somebody else who will still know the answer. And that was super helpful, having that community aspect of onboarding. Yes? So the question is, how do you get experienced devs to be able to teach? Honestly, a lot of that is going to be really hard. A lot of experienced devs forget what it's like to put themselves in the shoes and be a beginner learner. So one thing that you can do is honestly frame it like a skill tree for them. Be like, hey, I went to Stir Trek and this guy talked about something that I thought was really useful. In order to really understand this topic, they need to understand these other topics. And you can honestly write out a skill tree for them and be like, here are the things that they might not understand at the outset. And so when your experienced devs are going through the questions, they'll refer back to this and be like, okay, well, they need to understand this first. And then they can talk their way through the skill tree, as opposed to just being like, oh, I already know the answer to this question. I'm going to give a half-hour-long answer that's really confusing and too in-depth. Instead, they'll be able to go back piece by piece. Yes? Yep. Yeah, so the comment was just that a lot of this is applicable across the board, not just junior developers. I think the emphasis with junior developers is to have that patience, to have that knowledge that they're not going to be all the way up to snuff that you would expect from somebody else. So just keep that in mind. Be patient with them. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. Yeah, so the question was, is there any way that I could help these experienced developers build out the skill tree because they don't have an education background? I would say a really good answer for that is when they start talking about a subject, like I just gave you, I gave you the assignment of think through your day and write out all of the technology that you need. Give them the technology and say, write out all of the information that I would need to understand. If I'm really working with something that's template heavy, then they need to understand templating. And in order to understand templating, they need to understand HTML and this templating engine. And in order to understand that, they need to understand these things. And if you give them the broad picture and then say like, each step along the way, reassess the words that you're using. If it's a word that somebody new wouldn't understand, go ahead and write that word down and then go back and figure out what do they need to know in order to understand this word. And it could be even a collaborative activity. If you're working with them, then you're going to be like, wait, no, somebody wouldn't understand that. That wouldn't make sense to them. And so as a team, you could come up with these ideas of like, okay, well, here are the things that somebody needs to know. Did I see one up by, yes? So the question was, how do you help an old curmudgeon talk to a junior developer in like a friendly, warming, atmospheric way? And that's going to be really hard. And honestly, I haven't quite figured out. I've worked with some people in my past who are really tough at that. But there are ways that you can help the junior developer. And think of car salesmen intentionally curse around you. And they do that to throw you off guard and to be like, oh, did he really just say a cuss word? And then you feel more relaxed about them. One way that you can make your junior developer feel relaxed, and I'm not saying you need to insult your experienced dev, but be like, oh, well, he's a little bit tough to work with, so like take what he says with a grain of salt. If they know that they're not the only one being singled out by that person, then they'll feel more comfortable. If they know, okay, everybody on my team really dreads going to talk to this person, but like if I just put up with it, if I'm fine with it, if they have that expectation going in, then that's a lot more beneficial than like, oh God, this person hates me and he thinks that I'm a really stupid junior developer. So I'm not saying badmouth the person, but I am saying just like give them a fair warning. Be like, hey, this person might be a little bit tough to work with. Yes? Okay. Yeah, so what he just commented is that you have a reporting team. So if it's like a really big problem on your team, then make sure that your bosses know that this person is always a tough person to work with. And then it's the same way. If you have a junior developer, maybe they don't need to interact with that person on a super regular basis. For some teams that are smaller, it might be hard. But even if you have like one person slightly above them that they could interact with, that would be slightly more friendly and slightly more welcoming, then that would be a really good solution, is have them work more with the person who's like at their level than the person who's really smart but is hard to work with. Any more questions? Anything Anything from Slack? No? All right. Then I think that about sums it up. Thank you. Let me know if you have any more questions. Feel free to come up and chat with me. I'll be here for the next couple of minutes. Thank you again so much for joining my StirTech talk. I know you got a lot of options, so I appreciate it.